I know you're here to talk about your book, but I did just want to ask you about the big question it feels that our country is facing right now, the economy. You're a former chancellor, you're a successful businessman. What do you make of how Rachel Reeves is doing?
I worry. I think Rachel is incredibly talented and she will look at the data and it feels like a couple of things that are headwinds heading our way. One is wage inflation. So obviously some of the public sector wage settlements, I think, are out of kilter to where you want inflation to be, which you want to get back to target of 2%. And what the new government has been agreeing with, the train drivers and others is way above that. So it will put more pressure on the Bank of England in terms of holding it back from lowering interest rates. And therefore, cost of living, people's mortgages will, remain challenging. The other thing I worry about is we are importing high levels of, and it was, by the way, this is not a political point because it was equally a challenge for the previous Conservative government. We're importing high levels of low-skilled labour. So you look at the net migration numbers at 740,000, of which, obviously the illegal crossings is the one that sort of poisons the well of goodwill with the public, but it's about 40,000. But the big number is the net migration numbers. And we are now exporting, or people are leaving the country who are what I would call high talent. Now, obviously financial success or being a millionaire is not the only proxy for talent. I know that, but it's a pretty good proxy, and we are now probably only second to China.
So do you think that
of people who are leaving the country?
Do you think wealthy people are leaving the UK because they're worried about tax rises?
I think it's a combination of, right? It's tax rises.
Yes,
yeah. And I just think now that we've left the EU, if you look at the G7, 3 of the G7 are in Europe, the 4th is America. These are continental economies, and you can make an argument that if you want to trade there, you have to live with what we apply in terms of taxation. We're now a mid-size market, right, with 70 million people. So the competition will come from the UAE, from Singapore. So we've got to be much more cognizant of the fact that we've got to be attractive for talent.
There'll be some people who'll be listening to this saying, it's a bit rich coming from someone who was part of the last administration when there were huge strikes, which is why many people think that public sector pay rises are the only way to try and stop strikes that were embedded in the economy before. There was a huge tax burden under the Conservative administration and record levels of migration. It's a bit rich.
And as I just spoke about, I said, this isn't a political point. We had a similar challenge, although I have to say credit to Rishi Sunak is that he held firm on dealing with inflation, on fiscal responsibility, which is the bit that the government controls, versus monetary policy, which is the Bank of England. And he tried to hold firm on that and explain to the nation that why it's important to be quite firm with some of the union demands and say, look, we can't give you what you're asking for because it will just fuel inflation, which hurts everybody, because if the inflation remains high in the economy, it harms not just public sector workers, but private sector workers as well. So you're right, it was a challenge for us.
I'm keen to talk a bit about the challenges for your party, because you're now in opposition, kind of wrestling with the future of the Conservative Party. I noted you donated £20,000 to Robert Jenrick's leadership campaign through your company. It's publicly declared. I guess
it's my wife, so she's
Zahawi.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Does that mean that you're backing him for the leadership?
I haven't declared for any candidate. And
now's your chance.
Look, I will wait to party conference. I am a mere foot soldier for the party now. I want to see.
That could be a few awkward conversations if your wife's donated £20,000 to Robert Jenrick.
But look, ultimately, we live in a democracy. My book talks about coming out of a country run by a single party and Saddam Hussein, and people have free choices. But what I would say, I think Rob has run a brilliant campaign. I think we've got some very good talent in the other candidates, whether it's Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly, Kemi Badenoch. The candidate that can demonstrate to me that they can unite the party, because the reason I think we were thrown out of government is because the nation could see that we formed a circular firing squad. We got to a stage where Conservatives were going on TV, on your programmes, talking about the 5 families meeting at midnight in a smoke-filled room. You know, your viewers who are having to struggle with a mortgage payment and the cost of living, you know, would be incensed to think that the natural party of government, you know, the last 100 years, we've governed for 80% of that 100 years, speaking as if there's in some episode of The Sopranos, you know, as if we're some... I mean, it was insanity. And I think if we are not disciplined and we don't get back to unity, then that void will be filled by another party that's far more disciplined and focused on wanting to win votes.
Let's talk about your book. You've written a book, The Boy from Baghdad. You talk in it as well about your own family's experience finding refuge in the UK. And you obviously love Britain, but I was quite, you know, you do also speak about, I guess, some of the difficult moments that you had arriving as that boy from
really hard.
Baghdad.
Yeah, totally right.
And we've spoken about it before, I know.
Yeah, we have. Your first question is you sort of understand that your father had to flee, that you live in a state that had a dictator, but you still, at the age of 11, I've got an 11-year-old now, you formed, you know, a circle of friends, relationships, and it's really hard to be wrenched away from that, especially to you know, a strange place where you don't really speak the language very well. And so the early days and weeks, you know, I felt, you know, really depressed in many ways. It was cold, and miserable, and hard. But children are malleable. You very quickly adjust. Within 12 months, I'd picked up the language. I talk about, you know, picking up the Sun newspaper and you know, beginning to learn the language through the tabloids rather than... I tried the Telegraph and I couldn't at the time get my head around some of the columns. But, and then, of course, you begin to realise that in this country, if you share with people, adults, your fears, your hope, your aspirations, there are lots of people who will mentor you and give you a leg up, and you end up, you know, as I did, becoming an engineer and then building a great business that became a unicorn, and then obviously entering Parliament and then ending up as Second Lord of the Treasury. My cousin, by the way, who's slightly older than me, my first cousin, ended up in a very different place. He was conscripted to the front line for the Saddam's adventure, where Iran-Iraq war, got taken prisoner of war by the Iranians. For 12 years, we couldn't find him. The Red Crescent, which is the equivalent of the Red Cross, didn't have his name. The Iranians wouldn't list him. 12 years on, he turns up with a wife. He left with 2 babies, with 2 children that were sort of teenagers, or you know, 13, 14 years old. That could have so easily have been me. So every morning when I wake up, I just think I must be blessed to have landed on these shores.
I'm just wondering, because one of the most difficult things that we've experienced as a nation, we saw in the summer with the riots. How did the boy from Baghdad feel when you witnessed what was happening on the streets of Britain?
Yeah, and I wrote about this in the Times newspaper. I felt a couple of things. One, that we need to be intolerant of intolerance. We're the most tolerant nation, in my view, on earth. And in many ways, colourblind. You know, the people of Stratford-on-Avon have voted for Nadhim Zahawi, a boy from Baghdad, and every election I increase my majority. They are sort of 96, 97% white, affluent, you know, farming community.
Can I come in? Because you give me quite a sort of academic answer to this, like a politician's answer. But the question is, how did you feel when you saw it?
Terrible, because I begin to worry that the fabric of society, the values that we all share, doesn't matter what your background, your ethnicity is, was being pulled apart. And I think the reason I say to you about, you know, intolerant of intolerance is what we can't allow to happen in our country is minority groups will hijack, in my view, a religion, a great religion like Islam, and preach hatred and, you know, political Islam, which is deeply harmful. You know, I've always been an advocate of prescribing the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. Other Muslim nations have done that and are now in a period of incredible prosperity and enlightenment, like the UAE. I talk about in my
So do you blame
work.
that for the riots, then?
Well, part of that is, you know, people, immigrant stock, Muslim communities, we were looking at saying, you know, I don't recognise that as part of my community, part of my religion. But also the other side, by the way, we must be intolerant of fascist, people who are clearly racist, coming out and taking the law into their own hands. That is equally wrong. What you want is a society that pushes back on that behaviour as well.
You said earlier in the interview that you didn't read The Telegraph when you first came to the UK because the columns were perhaps too long for you. Now, just pretend the cameras aren't here, the mics aren't on, if you will. What's going on with The Telegraph? Are you bidding for The Telegraph?
So I think The Telegraph is a wonderful
you read it
newspaper.
Now, then?
I read it, I have the app, I check it daily. There's a process. It would be absolutely wrong. I was a businessman before becoming a politician to comment on that process because it is confidential. There are a number of bidders. I've always said publicly it would be an incredible honour for me and a real privilege if I were ever to chair The Telegraph or be involved with The Telegraph. But there is a process, and you've seen Redbird IMI, I think only yesterday, sold The Spectator, another great magazine.
So Paul Marshall, of course, the owner of GB News, bought The Spectator for £100 million.
Yeah.
So you got any comment on that? He's rumoured, of course, to be bidding for The Telegraph too.
Well, I think that is absolute credit to Fraser Nelson and Andrew Neil to take a magazine which not a long time ago was valued at about £20 million.
Andrew Neil wasn't that happy about it, was he?
To 100 million.
Tweeted about it.
And I think Andrew would have liked to see a different outcome. He's a friend and, of course, a wonderful interrogator of politicians. But I think, good luck to the team there. They are an incredibly talented team, and I think equally talented than The Telegraph.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Good to
Thank you for having me.